Hi, I'm Janice.
And I'm Darren.
And this is Event Horizon. So today we're going to be focusing on one of the large overarching questions that we're tackling with Event Horizon. How can humanity best meet this moment? Since the answer to this is days, maybe weeks worth of conversations, not an hour, we thought we'd start by focusing on two areas we see as including both challenges and opportunities that can be leveraged in service of our evolution: technology and AI, and gender. Before we leap, though, we want to check in with each other. So I'm going to punt it to you, Darren. How are you doing, and what are you chewing on these days?
Thank you. I'm doing well. I think, spending a lot of time, and this has been reflected in our conversations too, just thinking about this rising tide of challenges in the world that we're facing, and just the degree to which humanity seems to be able to bury its head in the sand collectively. Now, on the one hand, I recognize not everyone has the same capacity to be able to notice what's going on, or some people are incredibly busy in some parts of the world. They just don't have access to media necessarily to know what's going on. But I'm talking about for those of us who do have access to that media and time to reflect on these things, how still I don't see many people really remarking about this. And yet the world seems to get increasingly incoherent, almost by the week kind of thing. So that's been striking to me, but there's a silver lining there, because I think that increases the leverage and the potentiality for a real transformation for humankind, which relates exactly to what we talk about in this podcast and what was the impetus for this podcast. So I've been thinking about those things. How about you?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's all in the same vein, right? I feel like as a psychologist, one of the things I've most been shocked by is the human response to it. It's been wild, like just utterly wild. Like we tend to just do exactly what you said, bury our heads in the sand. So it's been, a multi-year journey now of like, why? What is that? How do we meet that? How do I assist people and myself? So that's the other thing. I spend a lot of time curious about this toggling back and forth. I know we talk about this a lot, sort of the big perspective, what's happening in the world, the grand design, the things that feel like they're all coming together and they're outside human auspices altogether. We don't even know how it happened that all these convergences, these converging streams are here. The amazingness of that, the fascination I have around that, the mechanisms, key players, and then my human experience, as you and I talked about, where I'm like, what does this mean and how do I be with it? So that toggling back and forth has been really fruitful, because it is helping me to think about how I can help others as well as myself. So in that, I'm also developing this new business. I'll be doing some training and supporting for people called Gianna Wise or J Wise. And I'm hoping to be able to drop a link into the bottom of our podcast at some point so that people can find me, and the offerings be starting that currently in August. So I'm excited about that too. It's a way that I can meaningfully contribute to the world. But this question that we are always circling around is, how are we meeting the moment? And it's easy to talk about it conceptually, but I wonder, Darren, how are you meeting the moment personally?
Well, it is sometimes challenging, but at the same time, like I kind of hinted at a few minutes ago, I do see the increasing incoherence in the world and the decohering that we're seeing as also, on the flip side of the coin, increasing the leverage we have to really create a transformational moment. So I do see it that way, that these things are always connected, that we might, in a microcosm, look at it and see like it looks like an emergency. It might seem like bad news, as I've said before. But from this more overarching perspective, I think the larger organism that is the cosmos, and even a smaller fractal than that, is trying to restore harmony to the system. And that can look like chaos a little bit in the short term, but it's because it's trying to drive us towards more holistic health. And there's a variety of variables that arise that I think are all part of that. So whenever there's chaos in the system, I step back and I go, this is also part of some sort of design, some sort of intention to restore harmony. So that changes how I look at the emergencies. I don't become overwhelmed by them, because I recognize, number one, this is just one incarnation amongst many. And I also see that overarchingly, things in their natural order are harmonious and balanced. And when they're not, there's always an attempt to make that happen again. So I look at that as what's happening here. So the chaos in the world, the incoherence in the world, to me also is the beginning signs of a storm system that's trying to clear something out so something new can emerge. So that helps me deal with the drama we're seeing in the world and see it as part of a solution and not just as an emergency. And what about for you? How do you look at this, and how does your perspective on consciousness and the nature of reality change how you deal with the moments we're in?
Yeah, thank you. Well, yeah, I mean, I think this is what brought us together in the first place, was talking about this fascinating convergence of, for me at least, the academic or intellectual parts of myself and the experiencer parts of myself. And it became clear to me in the mid-teens that we were heading into what was going to be a transformative time, that there were a lot of energy and consciousness elements to it, that in fact consciousness is the backbone. This is what's being offered up to humanity, is to expand our awareness, understanding, and capacity to move and navigate within this really wildly shifting landscape that is heavily energetic. So that component of it does affect me. Like, I like play in the intellectual, conceptual ideas. That's really fun. It really helps me to understand the big picture. But I have to admit that sometimes the energies in my body get really significant, and I have to learn how to work with those. So that's been, many years of working, and that's part of what I want to be able to assist others with. So yeah, let's kick it off with technology. The first question we were going to consider, and I'm going to ask you, is what role, in your perspective, is technology playing in both the peril and the promise of the present moment?
Right, so let me begin with the particular challenges that technology poses at the moment, because what's interesting about these matters is that there's always a dual-sided nature to it. So there's the potential challenges, but then also the opportunity. And the different matters we're going to cover over this series of podcasts each have these elements in them. So let me start with the particular challenges related to technology, remembering again that we will get to the opportunities afterwards. First thing I would say that's pretty obvious, I think, to a lot of people is that it keeps us distracted. That means that many, many people spend a lot of time scrolling on their phones, being on social media and whatnot, which in itself is not bad. It's more about the number of hours that people are spending, the number of their waking hours they're spending doing this, and this prevents them from doing other things. And so when we stay distracted and preoccupied, it tends to also make us neglect some other parts of our interiority that we could be growing, and maybe people in the past would have grown, and that keeps us placated and easily controlled. So that's the first thing I would say, is that technology keeps us distracted. And partly what I mean by that as well is that we now, as we all know, have these really sophisticated algorithms that notice your behavior on websites, for instance, on social media, and then custom deliver more of what you've already told the algorithm with your action that you want to see. And so there's been some people have talked about some algorithms know someone better than that person's spouse might know them because of their activity and behavior online. And then sometimes that creates sort of a direct sort of dopamine dump into people's minds. And again, it keeps them even more preoccupied. It fires them up, and they get kind of caught up in this cycle. So that's a key problem, I think, with technology in its current form, is that it keeps us distracted. And it's even working with brain chemistry to the degree to which it keeps us distracted. Another problem I would see with technology, or at least a challenge with it, is that we are incredibly highly dependent on it right now. So when we think about our ancestors and how they knew how to live off the land, and they knew how to take care of themselves, and they had certain survival skills. In the modern world, myself included, we're used to be able to go to the store and buy things. We can order things online. In general, we are incredibly reliant on our technological systems. We saw during COVID, for instance, how when these networks get disrupted, how things quickly become chaotic in terms of the cost of goods, the availability of goods and services. Everything kind of really was impacted. That was just a tiny glimpse of what would happen, for instance, if the grid went down. So the degree to which we're incredibly reliant on a technological grid, which is not all that safe or secure at this point, I think is another challenge with technology. Something else I would bring up is that we are racing towards what is called a technological singularity, and we tend to just always chase this. We don't ever ask if we should be doing this, so it really just becomes a question of when. When will we reach this point where basically technology creates a fundamentally different way of being human, and that is coming quickly. And again, this even could be our demise. We're going to talk about this when it comes to AI and whatnot. But again, one of our challenges with technology is that we race towards this horizon without ever asking if we should do it or how we should be careful about how we do it, which is wrapped up in capitalism and those kinds of things. The other thing I would say is that it creates a kind of control system scenario where everyone between their phones and their home computers basically is inviting different sources into their homes, so into our lives. This information's coming, And the information is being custom crafted in some ways to control people in various ways. I mean, politically, socially, and otherwise as well. And we're kind of willingly taking it in, and again, not really considering the consequences of that. So the degree to which it can beam into every home and create kind of control systems is another one of the challenges. Of course, with the burgeoning emergence of AI, we also have the challenge that in the short term, this could cause disruption in the labor market, for instance, as AI becomes ever more capable of doing things that humans have done in the past. In the long term, again, that becomes an opportunity, I think, to potentially move towards a post-work economy, which we'll get to in the parts where we have the opportunities. But in the short term, it creates disruption in our systems, number one. And of course, there's also the possibility that it becomes so powerful that it could be the seed of the demise of humankind, especially when you pair that with what I mentioned a minute ago, where we don't stop to consider these kinds of things and what's the best and most wise way to move forward. Last thing I'll bring up in terms of a challenge is how we are moving towards a cyborg kind of future. Already we're seeing signs, for instance, with Elon Musk's technology, where there's this Neuralink technology that has been inserted in people's minds. On the one hand, again, some amazing things could come out of that. People who don't have the ability to communicate might be able to through these links and those kinds of things. We might be able to restore mechanical motor ability in people's limbs, for instance, through technology. We certainly will, I think, at one point. But when does this point come where we cross some sort of threshold into sort of cyborgism or transhumanism? What do we lose in that process? And are we taking the time, again, to pause and to think about this? Even when we think about some of the messages from some forms of non-human intelligence, they've discussed taking that very path and then regretting some of the decisions that were made, and that there's been some suggestion even that the hybridization program is engineered around trying to restore something in them that was lost in that process, as well as potentially addressing some problem in our future as well. So in that way, it would serve both. But these are just a few of the challenges. I could point to more, but that's some to get going with. What do you see as challenges arising with technology in particular?
Thanks, Darren. Wow, that is a really comprehensive list. And I think you picked up on something that was one of the earliest things I noticed. I studied adolescents, right? And so you couldn't study teenagers without studying technology. So the minute it arrived, they're some of the earliest adopters and users. And I mean, it was obvious that it was always coming. I mean, we've always been here. I went to a school, as I told you, for math, science, computers. I hung out with lots of geeks. I was a geek. I was going to go. I was destined for the social sciences, not so much the tech industry, is where a lot of my schoolmates went. And I noticed what you talked about really early on. Like, I have these brilliant minds in the room and they always want to create. They can create. Their question is, can we do it? How do we do it? Not, should we do it? Is this a good thing? Me as a developmentalist on this side, I'm like, ooh, wait. Maybe we should talk a little bit about whether this is a good idea, because it was pretty obvious from the vantage points I had in the early 2000s that this was not going to be a good idea. Some facets of this were going to really erode human capacity for attention, human capacity for intimacy, human capacity just for absorbing information. I mean, it's not exaggeration to say that, you know, in the 1800s, we had maybe the equivalent of a few pages of a newspaper worth of information a day. And now it's, I don't know, it's like, what did I read? It's 174 newspapers worth daily. That was in 2007. So, you know, as a psychologist, I'm like, how are we going to be able to absorb and integrate and synthesize and make sense of, which is what our minds do, all of this stuff coming in? And also as a developmentalist focused on how people pass from childhood into adulthood, that's a tricky channel. And when you start adding in all the stimulus and access to anything you want 24/7, and you remove walls and time of day and anything like that as barriers and natural integration time, it's going to be really problematic. And, you know, so it has not been at all a surprise to see the ongoing debates around the effects of technology on mental health for everybody, for example. And I think, I guess, the only other piece that a response before I move on to what I think is some of the opportunities is this thing you also touched on related to attention. Attention is the primary commodity. I mean, Sean Parker, Facebook's first president, said the thought process that went into building these applications, Facebook being the first of them, was all about how do we consume as much of your time and conscious attention as possible. And the answer to that came from many disciplines over, you know, research across many decades. Business, psychology, economics, persuasion, and basically we're able to leverage massive amounts of knowledge about how we work to grab our attention, and we are just clueless. Like the average human has no idea how easy it is to capture attention and keep it. And now it's been commodified and it's making a small number of people very, very rich, but we are doing it. So from that angle, the psychological angle, the developmental angle, I then was like, all right, well, what's the opportunity for humanity here? And we talked going back out to that grand design, what's going on here. It was pretty clear that technology was going to dovetail with not only the human invitation to, but the human requirement to up-level our consciousness and our self-awareness and understanding. We won't make this passage if we don't, as you pointed to. The technology knows us better than we do by a lot. And there's going to be layers of the things it knows about how to work us that we're going to be completely programmed by because we don't understand it ourselves. So we can whine about that and say we're victims and blah, 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 but that is not the invitation in my mind. The invitation is like, okay, people and humanity, step up. How are you going to leverage this? And the path into that is all about self-awareness, working with mind, being able to command your attention, not have it be dragged around. It's not like anybody's shoving those phones under our nose. We open them up and look at them. So for me, it's like, do the inner work to decide how you want to use technology and not be used by it. That does mean there's a lot of places I don't show up, in social media and stuff. I just don't go there unless I really need to. And I keep it minimal because I can really feel the suck. But I think it's also helping us to, as a species, individually and collectively, move into a whole different set of possibilities. And that's the really exciting part, right? Like we're understanding instinctively the networked mind concept. What does it feel like to be in a network of people? And right now it's fully technological, but as you're saying, with the Neuralink and a variety of other things coming, it may not be. It may be transhuman, but also trans technology. I mean, we may learn how to interact with each other in vast networks, psychically or technologically enhanced ways. The other domain that I think is really important is relationships. What does it mean to be human? What does intimacy mean? Who is it really with? Is it with ourselves? Can you do intimacy with AI? I think it's an interesting question. I suspect some part of it, yes, because a lot of intimacy is about the self. On the other hand, intimacy with a real person has a whole other set of layers to it that are just irreplaceable, right? And I think we're learning a lot about that as we experiment in this view, in this space. Unfortunately, there's going to be a lot of weird experiences and testing out that do concern me. And if we don't do it with some degree of grace and consciousness, then it's not going to be good. That's the peril. I mean, the stakes are high here, right? And technology is a key component of it. So I guess to our listeners, just think about it in your own life and know that we're part of a grand experiment and a grand opportunity.
Yeah, some great thoughts there. And I think about that as well. This transition we are quickly approaching, this threshold around when do we depart from being fully human as we have been up until this point. And it is not a simple question, and there will not be simple answers. It's interesting, even when you again think about the question of non-human intelligence and these hybridization programs that have been conducted, part of the lore in terms of what has been communicated to experiencers and to abductees is that the reason why it happened when it did historically, right at the end of the 20th century, was so that they could access our genetics prior to us passing this threshold where suddenly now robotics and technology becomes really synced with the human genome. Of course, there's other things like we're beginning to edit the human genome, many potential possibilities there for helping improve people's lives, but many potential perils too. So it's very interesting to think about these things and really, as you pointed to, stop and reflect. As we approach these thresholds, really, both individually and collectively, it's so important for us to consider what the consequences are so that we can approach this with wisdom. Unfortunately, again, we do not see much of that being valued in society. We don't get together in a kind of tribal way and discuss these things, but we direly need to, I would suggest. But let me go into some of the opportunities that come with technology, because again, these are all double-edged swords. So the first thing, of course, is just the opportunity for global communication. It's remarkable the day we live in where we can share ideas across the planet. When I teach classes and when I even think about who is consuming this podcast and other podcasts I do, it's people all across the planet. And sometimes it's fun for me to get a message from someone saying they're really enjoying a certain podcast, and then I find out where they are in the world, and it's right across the entire globe, which is really exciting so that new ideas, fresh ideas can spread much more quickly. We can sort of benefit from collective wisdom and the power of the group, that kind of thing. Also, it means that you can find your tribe regardless of where you live. I live in the middle of a forest in a fairly small town in the southwest corner of North Carolina, but the people I'm connected to deeply, yourself included, are from all around the world. And you're in Colorado, I'm in North Carolina, and there's plenty of people that I know in Europe and in Asia and Australia and South America, on it goes. So that is something that has been made possible because of technology. So that's amazing. Nothing but good things there. Something else I would say, speaking of AI, and I've touched on this before in one of our previous podcasts, is that technology, and specifically artificial intelligence, also presents the possibility for tackling some of our most daunting challenges, things like distribution, and even more complex challenges like climate. We know that one thing AI can do that human beings don't do so well is it can consider 10,000 variables and try to bring out of that the best possible scenario or solution based on all those 10,000 variables. And it can consider them simultaneously. This is what people mean when they're talking about the multidimensionality of AIs, how it can consider these things simultaneously and come up with a solution that takes into consideration all of those factors. We as human beings can at the most consider a few factors simultaneously. And again, in the past, that created problems where we tried to have centrally controlled systems, socialist systems like in the Soviet Union, when you have a few bureaucrats in one central city making decisions and being unaware of those many, many variables and how the variables are weighted differently in different parts of the country and those kinds of things, you end up with a system that ultimately collapses. And that's not even addressing the corruption that unfortunately has been a big part of that history as well. But with AI, we have the possibility to consider incredibly complex systems and come to solutions. If, again, like you said, we use the technology rather than letting the technology use us. One other piece quickly about AI and also robotics and those kinds of things, and I touched on this a little bit, hinted at it in the list of challenges, is that this could ultimately move us towards a post-work economy. We could get to the point between AI and robotics and UBI, Universal Basic Income, right? If that was distributed across the civilization, then suddenly people would not have to work 40-hour weeks. And we could actually spend time, because we have so much more time, developing this rich interiority. Now, again, we still have to willingly detach ourselves from technology, not get swallowed up in the algorithm engines that are just feeding our dopamine streams. We have to choose to detach from that, let AI and robotics do its thing so that we can benefit from it. But then we begin to explore our rich interiority. That could be the burgeoning of consciousness development like we've never seen before, at least in potentia. So these are some of the things I think about in terms of the real possibilities that come online with technology as well.
Yeah, you touched on a lot of really important stuff there, but I think the thing that's the biggest that keeps coming back is that statement that NHI made to Philip Corso, the guy whose story was told in The Day After Roswell, about an NHI contact where he was told that what's in the offing for us is a new world if we can take it. I reflect on that a lot because I think that the human response to that is, oh, great, maybe somebody's going to come and give us a whole new world. And I want to say, no, the alchemy process is us. We're the new world if we can take it. So if we could take it, for me, means like if we can become the alchemical process that is consciousness expanding. Because if we cannot, I'm quite convinced that all of the things you said about AI and technology and the challenges and perils that it holds for humanity are what we're headed for. We are absolutely essential. And the we that's essential is not just showing up as consumers or as, people giving attention, but we need to understand what's really happening, and we need to engage in a way that's intelligent and careful and thoughtful, and that leads to the betterment of society. So I think we're at a really amazing moment. Will we use this amazing technology that is clearly available and coming to clean up our environment, to enhance life wherever we find it, whether it's human life or others? Will we spread out the benefits of our technological achievements through things like a UBI? These are all questions I think are absolutely essential. They are not side questions, because the answers to them will dictate everything that happens next. I mean, there are moments I know you and I talk about, I'm like, ooh, I just don't know if we're going to be able to do this. But on the other hand, it's hard not to be really excited by the potential. Humanity's never been in a moment, at least this current iteration of humanity, like this. And you and I and everybody who tunes into things like this are part of it. There's the human, each one of us getting it and doing the work to really be able to absorb and expand and be that consciousness emerging. And then there's the ways in which we connect and network to steady our ship, to direct it in a way that's going to be beneficial for humanity and all life in our planet, and make sure that what needs to happen happens so that we can leverage the opportunities.
Yeah, and thinking about what you said there, I think one thing that many people are not aware of is that this transition to something like an AI robotics system where we have UBI is not just this idealized version of our future. We are going to need to make a transition to something different. As Eric Weinstein even discussed in an interview, which I think I touched on in a previous episode, communism, capitalism, there's two sides of that coin. Neither one of those are going to be tenable in the future. We're going to have a new system. The fuel for what creates the growth that's part of capitalism is based on certain conditions, and those conditions are going to be fundamentally changed when AI and robotics fully come online. So we're going to need a new system. This is not just about dreaming a way that people wouldn't have to work. We will get there. And then the question becomes, what is most flourishing for a future humanity? What would be the most idealized version we can imagine? Because it really comes down to what we're willing to dream about and what we dream about together, because we will have remarkable potential. Now, you talked about wondering if we will make this transit successfully. I think that is an ongoing question, which is quite daunting at the moment. But even if we do, then we really need to spend some time again in reflection, considering variables, considering the full breadth of humankind and human life, and weigh together what we would build together, what we would grow together that would be the ground for the most flourishing future for us as a species. Because again, with what's happening with AI and robotics, human beings will not be necessary either for intellectual work in the same way they have been before, as well, of course, in terms of labor. So, as someone recently pointed out, this has become kind of a social media meme, speaking of social media. As one person was saying, I don't want AI to write poetry and write music. I want AI to do the laundry and the dishes so that I can focus on writing poetry and writing music. And I think that's the kind of question we need to focus on here. Not just let it blindly lead us, but we need to give some forethought to what kind of future do we want and begin to put into place now the considerations that will lead towards that. But again, part of the challenge is that we race so quickly, so mindlessly towards this technological future that we end up being dominated by it rather than us taking the lead in this. So this is something we really need to all reflect on. And like you pointed to, Janice, this begins with each of us giving some thoughtful reflection to our relationship with technology, because it does no good to talk about how we will address that as a collective if we don't individually begin to ask those questions too. So what we would encourage people to do, I think, is be aware of your own consumption of technology. Do you feel like it's actually enriching your life? Is it making you more of the kind of person you feel called to be or not? And give mindful awareness to every moment you spend with technology. I would say that's one way we can begin to explore these things. And from that discovery individually, we can then come together and talk as a collective, as a tribe, about how we think we should best move forward.
Yeah, thank you. I love that. I think in some ways, one of the biggest challenges humans have is we're kind of lazy. And our sense that, we've created all these things that should just sort of allow us to do what we want, quote unquote, is understandable. And I get it because, I like vacations too. But it's really not cutting it here. Where we are is asking us to stand up, become aware of where's your attention going. Do you want it to be going there? Is it serving you? Is it serving the people that you love? Is it serving humanity? If it's not, if the answer to any one of those things is, this isn't good, then you need to exercise the muscles. You need to maybe build the muscles it takes to say, okay, I'm going to do something different. It's in that space where we have some muscles like a gym work to do. It's, mental, emotional. It's this interesting synthesis of a variety of different sort of inner muscles that people are really not used to using that I think is where we're most getting stuck. So I just want to add to what you're saying. Please do examine it and then start building the muscles, start small. But it also links to another conversation we've had, which is in the world that a lot of us really want, For example, being able to freely interact with non-human intelligences that are beneficial for us, for example. A lot of that communication happens telepathically, right? Well, when telepathy happens, it allows people to peer into sort of pockets of your inner self that you might think are hidden. So the other message I want to say is learn to live a clean inner life in balance, because you're visible. You're going to be increasingly visible. All that stuff that you feel like people can't see will be increasingly visible as we move toward where a lot of us are saying we want to go. We can't afford to be lazy if we're going to interact. It's not a lazy endeavor. So that's both kind of the peril is our laziness. The opportunity is us to build in entirely new ways and having completely new, amazing experiences, which I think leads us really nicely into this next piece. Gender, right? And I'd love for you to just set the landscape here because we've had some great conversation. You've had some wonderful insights on sort of the role of the divine feminine and masculine in this process.
I think as we begin to address this topic, we want to remember that this is not just about gender per se. This is about the divine masculine and the divine feminine as principles, which are generally represented more so, for instance, the feminine in women and the masculine in men, but that's not an absolute. And ideally, as each of us as individuals, we want to develop a healthy balance in ourselves. So if we tend towards more of the one, we want to give some attention and develop more of the other. And that begins with being aware of the other. So let's spend a little time setting the table in terms of the divine masculine versus the divine feminine. So a couple things I would say. One is that this superpower that each of these has also is its potential downfall, or at least its potential weakness. It's a subtle difference in expression or degree of expression that comes in there. So for instance, with the masculine, that's very agentic. And I'm speaking there of the quality of being an agent, particularly an active agent, who has the ability to make choices and act independently. That's agency. So the masculine has a very strong sense of that. But that ability to act as an independent agent also can sometimes mean that the masculine is disconnected from the whole. So again, this is both a potential strength, but also a potential weakness we need to be aware of. In the feminine, we have the capacity to be incredibly connected to the whole, and that wisdom of the understanding of the whole is what's largely lacking in our society today. But just like with the masculine, the flip side of that is that it can also move towards being enmeshed. Enmeshed refers to a relationship or a situation where boundaries are blurred and individuals become overly involved or entangled with each other's lives. And in the context of family dynamics or psychology, it describes where personal boundaries are not well defined, leading to a high level of emotional dependence and difficulty in maintaining individual autonomy. So dependence rather than interdependence. I think what we're aiming for is interdependence. But I just want to bring that up because each of these have great strengths to offer, but also when they're in isolation, also can move into some weaknesses. And again, they balance each other when they're in conversation, in communication, and when both are represented in reality. So that's the first thing I would say about both the strengths and potential weaknesses of both the masculine and the feminine. Now, let's just discuss a few bullet points in terms of what tends to be represented in the divine masculine and the divine feminine, and we'll keep that in mind as we get into our discussion about gender and human civilization. So the divine masculine is represented with things like strength and courage, assertiveness and leadership, logic and rationality, independence and autonomy, like I just discussed, action and drive, and protection and provision. Again, these are the general kind of notions we associate with the divine masculine. Now, for the divine feminine, there's some different ones, but I think as we hear them, we'll realize they're equally as important, and really we will recognize that we need to have a balance of the two to have a harmonious system. The first is nurturing and compassionate. The second is intuitive and wise. Then we have creativity and flow, receptivity and openness, emotional depth and sensitivity, and patience and grace. So those are some notions that are more often associated with the divine feminine. Again, I think if we consider both the divine masculine and the divine feminine, we recognize that both of those have something to offer, but they balance each other when they're in relationship. Now, I want to say one more thing about the way this is often represented in the yin and the yang. So this is a concept where we have a fundamental principle in Chinese philosophy and culture representing the idea of balance in the universe. So this comes down to the yin, which again, I think you'll see how it maps to the masculine and the feminine. The yin represents the feminine, passive, dark, and cool aspects. It's associated with the moon, night, water, softness, and introspection, and symbolizes qualities like receptivity, nurturing, and intuition. The yang principle, on the other hand, represents the masculine, its active, bright, and warm aspects. It's associated with the sun, day, fire, solidity, and activity, and symbolizes qualities like strength, assertiveness, and logic. So what we really want here is a dynamic balance between these two. And there's a symbol that people probably will recognize that's associated with the yin and yang. Taijutsu is the symbol, and we have this kind of flowing together of the dark and light, or the black and the white. This is meant to represent a dynamic balance, which is always in a constant state of flux, and that they are dynamically balancing each other. So this is what is represented in the sort of cosmic order, and we need to give some consideration to how is this lacking in modern human civilization. So that's some beginning notions to get us started here in terms of what is the divine masculine and divine feminine, what is represented in each of those, how do they need to flow together to create balance and harmony. But I'd love to turn it over to you, Janice, to give some reflections on both challenges and opportunities you see when you think about gender and how it's currently represented in our society.
Thank you, Darren. I love that intro. This is such a nuanced topic for me because it's, well, as a woman in this society, it's impossible not to notice how masculinely oriented it is. I could talk for days about experiences and perceptions, and I think that's one of the benefits of being in a female body at this particular time. It becomes very clear, and yet it's really kind of hard to know where to start. I think, I've been tracking the gender stuff for a really long time because I was born in the 60s, grew up in the 70s and 80s, the heyday of, I was going to say feminism, but it's not even just that. It was really just acknowledging in the 70s that things like domestic violence and sexual assault and sort of the things that are happening in that inner space, whether it's the inner space of a person or the inner space of a family or the inner space of a community, that was often shielded from public view, are really, really consequential. And that there's things happening in there that are probably need to stop. So that was when I entered the world professionally, it was really into that landscape. One of the things I want to say to listeners, because we didn't really acknowledge it, is that right now we're in a space of a lot of gender fluidity, right? I mean, it's easy. We're talking about sort of the stereotypical masculine and the stereotypical feminine. I know we all know what those poles look like, and they're really important, and we're going to continue talking about them. But I just want to acknowledge that I remember when the gender bending pieces started to come in and vividly in the late 90s and early 2000s going, ooh, this is really interesting. And I think it's going to help that all this fluidity is really wigging a lot of people out, but it's probably going to help break down or soften some of the rigidities that are going to have to change in order for us to go through this passage that we're in. And I do see it that way. Like, I think that's part of the reason I think we're talking about this today. The gender concepts and the way those energies work, those principles work both within us and collectively, are part of our challenge. So we really do need to rejigger the way things look, partly because we need to preference, I think, some of the styles that have historically been marginalized. It's not about going inside in the dark. It's about being able to pull your attention inside and pay attention to what you're feeling in the field. That's where all that divine feminine principle empathy comes from. It's really much easier when you're not out producing, fixing, creating, thinking about what can happen, when you've learned how to pull that in, center it, and then send it out in the more subterranean ways. What are the energies that are flowing through these different systems? What are the energies that are flowing in this conversation that we're having? That skill, I think, is, I mean, it's not, doesn't belong to either one of the principles exactly, but that going inside piece is super important. If you want to be able to do that, you really do need to be able to retract all the outward focused energy, which is so yang and so dominant. And it's hurting us. I think that's the other thing. With that energy taken to the hilt, which is kind of what we have now, all it wants to do is compete, conquest. I mean, I feel like everything becomes a game of, as you and I talked about, capture the flag, who's going to win and whose team's going to win. And everything gets viewed first through a very, very thick, sophisticated threat veil. How is this going to threaten me, either physically or my family, right? How's it going to threaten me? But also, how's it going to threaten my status? How's it going to threaten my positioning, my access to resources? These are all the things that are killing everything beautiful. And so I know there's a lot of like, well, what do we do? Because we don't want to drop those really important ways of being in the world. And the answer is, I don't know exactly, but I think we need to start asking those questions, because this desire to manage, conquer, control, kill, see everything as adversarial or not, to transactionalize everything, is literally why our planet is struggling, why people are struggling, and why you and I have talked about people are brutalized. Women and children especially are brutalized by that in ways that lead to, in a lot of the conversations I have with women where I ask, what do you want men to know? Often results in, we want them to know we don't feel safe, and everything you're doing is not making us feel safer. And you really do want us to feel safe. You want the divine feminine inside you and outside you to feel safe. It's really important. So the other pieces too, I think conceptually, is speaking to what you talked about. The divine feminine principle seems to me, as somebody who has to leverage my masculine regularly, is in touch with my feminine. The divine feminine principle offers to this moment some pretty important things, like the capacity to, all right, keep the threat veil, like keep it on guard, but don't meet everything with that. Meet it with curiosity. Meet it with openness, with receptivity, with just, who are you? What are you? What do you want? And you can have your warrior standing right by you in case something starts to smell bad. But let's not start by sending the warrior out. Let's start by sending out the welcomer, the one who's curious and gracious and wants to welcome you in. That's the divine feminine principle, I think. The other thing that the divine feminine principle offers that we really need is connection. Capture the flag is not the right thing right now, guys. Get in our little teams and figure out who can get there first is not helping us. I think we really do need to be working in connection and collaboration and network, and be asking, how can we come together to maximize our reach and our capacity to assist people in this awakening process so that they can understand. And it is sometimes a subtle shift, and sometimes it's really a massive shift, but it's a really important shift. That is something I think the feminine just knows how to do. When we get stressed, when the feminine, there's been lots of studies on this, when women get stressed in general, again, we're talking about stereotypical women, they tend to befriend. They tend to sort of go into self-care and then reach out for support from others. And I'll tell you, it's good. It's a really good thing. It helps a lot. Men tend to isolate and want to control, and that hurts them. It's one of the reasons why the suicide rates among middle-aged men are highest of all groups. It's why loneliness epidemic is flourishing. It's part of the reason probably why we're having an increasing gap in genders in all sorts of demographic ways that we won't talk about right now, but we can talk about at some point. So anyway, I've talked a lot. There's more I want to say, but I want to give you a chance to dive in here too.
Yes, so I have a few thoughts from what you shared. The first one is related to that notion of we need to move past this game of capture the flag. That speaks also to the technological moment we're in, because when we were fighting with sticks and stones and bows and arrows and those kinds of things, even cannonballs, that to some degree could happen. It was kind of silly and a bit immature, but it didn't threaten the biosphere in the process. Now with nuclear weapons and bioweapons and such, that game of capture the flag threatens the entire human civilization, as well as the biosphere, all of the many animal species in our midst as well. And I think it goes without saying, but perhaps I will say it just because we should probably make note of this, that this generally relates to the fact that our technology has marched far ahead of our consciousness development. So our capacity to kill ourselves has chased ahead of our understanding of who we truly are and how we need to healthily relate to each other. And that puts us in a really difficult predicament. So in that sense, these two topics we're addressing today, technology and gender, are really connected in a really key way, because only by getting the gender aspect right will we begin to alter our relationship with technology in a way that it doesn't end up destroying ourselves. The other thing that comes to mind too is that we're not saying that the future is therefore going to be where people are half feminine and half masculine. It doesn't work that way. We're not talking about eliminating gender or eliminating differences. This comes down to sort of the notion of unity in diversity. They are different and they're beautiful in their own ways, and we want to acknowledge that and champion that. We're not trying to flatten everything. That is not the solution here. But a man who has a strong masculine presence can still develop these feminine principles within themselves. And I think you would argue that that would just make them more attractive to the feminine, and it also just makes them more fully formed. And so it's not like you lose one while you gain the other. I think it's important to point that out. Something else I'd say too is that, and I touched on this, I think, in our first episode, that we need to really, really, really have a deep conversation about this. And that begins with, for instance, having moments where we have forums where we can listen to each other. And women can share what you touched on earlier, that feeling of not feeling safe. What kind of world are we in that creates that kind of scenario? And have plenty of listening happening before we start talking about how we should take action. So this goes much deeper than, for instance, just filling quotas so that more women have more positions in executive positions. That's important, but more rooted than that is a question around what should leadership look like to begin with. It's not just about women who can manage to adopt the masculine principle and act more like men and therefore succeed. We need to consider the entire way that we structure our society, we structure leadership to allow for those feminine principles to come in and be equally represented. And again, I just want to emphasize here, this is the cosmic order. This is the way things are in nature if you pay attention. And in human civilization, we're just lacking that balance.
Gosh, you make so many different good points there. So I just want to comment on a couple of them. I mean, one is that, you're right. It's really not about an out there policy thing. It's just not. It starts inside each of us. And again, it comes back to consciousness. You can't really appreciate the way that the divine masculine and feminine interplay in society and the ways they could play together in society until you really experience it more locally, right? This again comes back to consciousness. Well, what stops us from doing that? Usually fear, stigma. Ask yourself when you're quiet, and it may take a little while to get a full, robust answer, but how much of your life is crafted in response to what you're avoiding or what is scary or what could, you don't want to have happen? When I asked myself that in 2007, I was shocked. I was like, oh my God, a lot. I think it's similar here. I think there's a lot that we avoid simply because we're not supposed to go there. But I would argue, and you definitely touched on this, that access to these principles and the gifts that they bring and skills and capacities they bring within each of us is a human right. It's not a man's right or a woman's right. And in fact, I think a lot of the ways we're so much easier to control because we don't have our full range of human apparatus basically online. So, just speaking to men around that, it'd be really beneficial for you as a human and us as a society, for men who don't already have some touch with their intuitive body, those ways of knowing that are not cerebral, that you sensed probably in the women around you. Some of them, not every woman has this in spades, but I'm sure you know some of them, that you sensed it. You can develop that too. In fact, it'd be really, really good if you did. A lot of the reason men don't isn't because they don't have it. It's because there's been so many stigmas built up around it, right? So I think that is really one of the things that you and I are really excited about, and one of the ways in which humanity stands to come online in a completely new ways. It'll be through these doorways. By the same token, women also are learning how to access that more outward focused, pointed, linear move, step ABCD till you get to this endpoint and something amazing has been created. That process is not necessarily wholly intuitive, but we're all being called to that too. It's really interesting to watch. I was talking with some girlfriends recently, and I was like, if we're going to talk to men, what would we as women want men to know? Well, there's no one thing. I mean, there's several things. I don't speak for all women, so don't take it that way. But within the worlds that I occupy in myself, there are two really dominant messages. And the first is the most important, which is you are needed and loved and wanted. I think a lot of men are feeling like, well, y'all are going to take over and then you just don't need us anymore. And that is not true at all. In fact, I'm quite clear that we can't evolve as a species without the masculine evolving and coming with us. It doesn't ever get left behind. It's central. It just needs to broaden. It just needs more. And the other thing, it's super fun. I think you talked about this, right? Like you start adding these different pieces and opening and bringing your curiosity and your openness and your receptiveness. And you're like, okay, what's this about? You start doing that and the results are fun. And they don't look or feel the same in a man as they do in a woman. Don't worry about that. It's not going to turn any man into a woman. And then the other piece is, and this is more the ask for the masculine, because the masculine sensibility has basically commandeered all of what we call reality. We all think of this as like, it's normal. This is what reality is. And we're like, no, it's really not. It's forged out a very particular set of sensibilities about what's important, et cetera, et cetera. But the way we've set things up is really hurting life. It's really hurting a lot of women. It's hard as a woman to take. It signals you don't really matter. You're disposable. Women are disposable, and it's okay if they get hurt. What I'm hearing more and more from my girlfriends and women in my life is we're feeling really kind of afraid, and we're feeling afraid of the things that the masculine is doing in the world. We're not afraid of each other. We're afraid of that. Could you please help however you can help? So I think those are the two big messages I'd give men. And I really long for the time when we can have these conversations about what can we create together in a way that's totally new. But I know it's going to have to come from an open self, an open consciousness, not just a set of policies or ideas. And that's a process that's going to take a little time.
Right. As numerous things I reflect on there, I think first I want to begin with just a bit of a personal share here that for me, I think in my 20s, for instance, I was very linear and transactional in the way that I treated the world, almost to an excessive degree. Like I think even then, when I got quiet, which wasn't very often at that point, I recognized that that train that was running at full speed was not headed for a good outcome in the long term, but I had no capacity to understand how to change that course or to change that behavior because there's a lot of hormones driving that, right? This is a big part of the question too, is how hormones come in. We are in bodies that are male and female. This changes how we experience the world. But then through my relationships with women, primarily my main romantic relationship in my 20s and 30s and 40s, really introduced me to a different reality. And at first I resisted it. It seemed unfamiliar. It seemed foreign. It seemed like it couldn't be because it was so different than the masculine way that I interacted with the world. But over time, I began to see how amazing it was and how complementary it was, and how when in combination with more of the masculine principles, it restored harmony in myself, in that relationship, and I saw how it could restore harmony in the world. And so for me, a huge part of my life experience as an adult has been about learning from the feminine, because plenty of the masculine was already online. That was not difficult for me. But incorporating these other aspects just makes it feel like, to me, that I've gained 360-degree vision, where it just helps me to function in a more holistic way, in a more expansive way. And I don't ever feel like one loses out because the other one has come into the picture. And I really want to encourage men that that's what we stand to gain as a species, as a civilization. And I think in the macro, what kind of things do we gain if we really are willing to have these deep conversations and then begin to dream together what this reality would look like, where we really have the masculine and the feminine equally represented in our civilization? First of all, I think we should point out we have not really seen this before. This is uncharted territory. And you and I last night were talking about this, Janice, that we really need to have plenty of time to dream together because we are not seeing examples of this in human history. So number one, we have the opportunity to rebalance the system. Secondly, men get to rediscover a part of themselves that they've been cut off from, right? We often talk about, and absolutely central to this, is how women have been marginalized. But also men have suffered from not letting that capacity in themselves grow. And this relates back to when men as adolescents are told, you should mute your emotions. It's not manly to act in certain ways. So men really suffer too. So men really stand to gain in themselves as well if we can begin to have these conversations. And of course, then women get to explore their role in the whole. We really have not seen that happen up until now. We also see the healing of long-standing wounds. I've talked about how I've seen some people host conversations, for instance, between Germans and Israelis around coming together to try to heal the collective energetic wound that was the Holocaust. That might be historic, it might be in the past now, but the energy, that incredibly dense void, is still in our energetic midst. And so it needs to be worked with. It needs to be energetically engaged with to begin to heal those wounds. Much of that also applies for women when it comes to how they've been marginalized for centuries and centuries, millennia in many cases. So I think some men sometimes get a little bit taken aback by how much anger they can pick up just beneath the surface. Absolutely, that's there and it's there for a reason. But once we have these conversations and women have the opportunity to be heard and be able to process that energy, like any other kind of energy, it will morph. It'll shift into something different, into something collaborative and creative. But we have to do it in that order. We can't just pretend that history didn't happen. So this is where you and I, Janice, have talked about like kind of a truth and reconciliation process that needs to come in as well. That needs to be a central part of this so that we can get to this new world that you talked about earlier. And the last thing I want to quickly point to before I turn to you for final thoughts here is that even with non-human intelligence, we see sometimes that people will experience a certain being that really has no genitalia. So there's nothing physically indicating that they're masculine or feminine, male or female, and yet often they do pick up that it's one or the other. Whitley Strieber's talked about one particular being that he picked up that feminine nature from her and felt quite a strong bond. So we see that this is not just about physical appearance or bodies per se, it's about these principles. And even amongst these non-human intelligences, we see this cosmic order reflected. So again, we want to move towards a future where we have the balance, where we're not canceling either out. We want to basically just reflect what really is, that all of the disorder and the incoherence in our system right now is because we're living in ways that is not reflective of the cosmic order. All we're asking for is a rebalancing so we can live according to those principles. Let me turn it over to you for some final thoughts.
This is the one that really is like, we should do a podcast because this is part of it. It weaves itself through everything, the individual, the interpersonal, the personal, locally and globally. Like I see it reflected everywhere. So it does feel like if we can work this inside ourselves, it's a massive gift to the entire world. There's a lot of pain. I mean, I as a woman have ready access to that pain. I can touch it in a second. And sometimes I can't help it. It comes flooding in and it's overwhelming and it's from millennia. We have to transmutate that somehow. And we're the ones on tap, us, all of us listening, are the ones alive to do that. So thank you for taking it on.
So we're just getting started. I think there's many people out there listening that feel the same passion we do about creating a new world, creating a new civilization. And yeah, just to close here, what we've done today is reflect on technology and gender and the key components they are in terms of this overarching question about the moment we are approaching, this consequential moment as a species, which on the one hand is quite daunting, but also represents the possibility for true transformation. And if nothing else, it's highlighting where we need to see change happen, where transmutation needs to happen, where an alchemical collective shift needs to happen. So that's what we're all about on this podcast. We're glad that you're with us on the journey, and we'll continue moving forward. So that's going to do it for this week's episode of the podcast. We hope you'll join again in a few weeks' time for another edition of Event Horizon.